I'm going to do my slides with that. Who can use? Yeah, I think this is. No, I'm just using this way. Up, down.
Like I'm not gonna work over with days Excel. I need to write things before the evaluation.
Well,
no, you can. I mean, you read wow, those quite a lot. Okay.
but why do we have to read? Oh, you have to read. Sorry. Okay. 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 Very good.
Okay. So you think.
Well, I think I'd better start. And this is on Keynes as a policymaker. There's really too much in this lecture, and I'll try and cut out as much as possible. But let me start by saying that he always had a clear political aim in all his policies, and that was to preserve liberal political and economic life against revolutionary assault. And the general theory was specifically announced as an alternative to fascism and communism. It's worth just looking at that. And that's what he wrote in the general theory. So, what was wrong with capitalism? What was wrong with the system that required it to be reformed and made it vulnerable to revolution? Well, he tried to stake out an anti-Ricardian lineage into his own theory of statesmanship. And you know, you can find all these things in chapter 23 of the general theory, where he found fragments of practical wisdom in the mercantilists, where he also praised the anti-usury laws of medieval Europe. He praised Thomas Malthus and Bernard Mandeville because they wanted more consumption. And he even said that the spirit of Silvio Gesell, who is a monetary crank reformer, but not that cranky, of the early 20th century, has more to teach us than the spirit of Karl Marx. So there's, that's his lineage. And then, of course, he engages with J.A. Hobson as well, and the underconsumptionist theory. So he's trying to stake out a historic lineage for his particular way through the conflicts of ideas in the 20th century. And his Oxford disciple, Roy Harrod, condemned him. He said, you should leave out this chapter, which is, I quote, a tendentious attempt to justify imbeciles. But Keynes said, no, these cranks, as you call them, often prefer to see the truth obscurely and imperfectly, rather than maintain error reached by easy logic on hypotheses inappropriate to the facts. So, that's a swipe at economists, of course. And more importantly, Roy Harrod, in criticizing Keynes for this chapter, failed to notice that he was staking out a position on economic policy distinct from that of both the defenders of laissez-faire capitalists and of socialists. So he rejected both the conservative idea that private enterprise constrained by competitive markets was naturally beneficial, was naturally beneficent, and the left-wing idea that capitalism was so exploitative that the only remedy was to abolish it. And so he tried to devise not in a middle way, although you can call it a middle way, but let's say an orthogonal way, a Keynesian way, which was separate from these two positions, which dominated, of course, the debates of the time. There were, you know, those adamant defenders of laissez-faire, and there were socialists, and they fought. That was the ideological background. And Keynes took a different position. He said, no, there's another way. So this led him to a particular kind of anti-capitalist capitalism, in which the enemy is not capitalism, but a particular type of capitalism, which is financial or rentier capitalism. And that is the important enemy against which all Keynes's theory and his statesmanship is directed. Well, let's see how he gets there quickly. Sorry, here. So this is how he starts chapter 24 of the General Theory. The outstanding faults of the economic society in which we live are its failure to provide for full employment and its arbitrary and inequitable distribution of wealth and incomes. You need, Keynes always used words very carefully, and these words were very carefully chosen. So the first half of that is easy enough. Unemployment, mass unemployment is a fault that my general theory is directed against. But what about the second half? How is it connected? Was it connected at all? Or did Keynes simply say, well, you know, that's someone else to deal with that bit. I just deal with this bit. No, of course they were connected. And they were connected in a particular way, because capitalism's failure to provide for full employment was indeed a function of the arbitrary and inequitable distribution of wealth and incomes. But before we jump to the conclusion that this really established Keynes as a socialist, and he just didn't deal with socialism in general theory, that's not true. The causal link is much more complicated and interesting than that. Because why did you use the word inequitable to start with? More familiar would have been unequal. And that would have put him firmly in the socialist camp. But inequitable is something quite different. For example, a highly unequal distribution of income might be equitable if it was considered fair. And also, nothing is more inequitable than to treat unequals equally. So equitable has a very precise meaning in Keynes. It's not the same as unequal. Inequitable just means that something that is considered normal, customary, and harmful has been disturbed in some way by something arbitrary and disruptive. That is really the context in which he thinks of inequity in the modern world, a disruption of arrangements considered to be equitable. And what does disrupt them more than anything else? That is changes in the value of money. So, which we talked about, of course, in previous lecture, in the second lecture. So there you have the connection, and I think it's very interesting. And you know, he makes it quite explicit here in this quotation from the Tract on Monetary Reform. Inflation means justice to individuals and classes, particularly to investors, and therefore unfavorable to saving. And deflation is unjust because it leads entrepreneurs to restrict production and so forth. So inflation is unjust and deflation is inexpedient. Of the two, perhaps deflation is the worst, because it's worse in an impoverished world to provoke unemployment than to disappoint the rentier. So he makes his choice there. It's worse to provoke unemployment than to disappoint the rentier. We may have a problem with his use of the word investor here, because what he means by investor is saver. It's not someone who actually puts money into a new enterprise. That's the entrepreneur. Here, investor is simply saver. So he's putting himself on the side of labor and enterprise against savers and rentiers. And so actually Keynes is a moderate inflationist. There's no doubt about that. He says we don't have to choose. He believes you should have a controlled inflation, a small inflation, because it's always necessary to get the stimulate the entrepreneur a bit, because otherwise the depressive and deflationary spirits are too strong. Now, this view of social injustice is very different from the left's view of it as systematic income inequality, rooted in class ownership of the means of production. It's also more conservative in its policy implications, obviously, than the left's view, because the disease of unemployment can be cured by stabilizing the price level of prices or output, rather than by abolishing capitalism or redistributing wealth. So it's a more limited attack. Let's follow the thread a little further of his thought. The classics believed that investment depended on saving. The more saving there was, the more investment there would be. As Keynes wrote, the duty of saving became 9/10 a virtue and the growth of the cake the object of true religion. That's one of his famous phrases for economic consequences of peace. Savers had to be encouraged to save by high real interest rates. The higher the reward for saving, the more saving there would be, and the more saving there would be, the more investment there would be. So a falling price level automatically raised real interest rates and therefore meant more investment. So on the whole, sort of classical policymakers, and this was one of the features of the gold standard, they preferred falling prices to rising prices, because you would get with fixed nominal interest, you would get rising real interest rates. Now, of course, Keynes came to reject the view that the propensity to save had any close connection with the accumulation of capital at all. And there's a famous passage which brings this out. And I quote, here it is. I won't read all this up because I don't have much time, not very much time, but you can read it. So it's enterprise, not thrift, that builds cities. And further, you'll always get enough thrift if there's enough enterprise. So what he's saying is that in Keynes's theory, it's not saving which wags the dog, investment, but investment which wags the dog, saving. And this puts Keynes firmly on the side of the borrower and not the lender, the debtor and not the creditor. Now let's look at the third topic, Keynes and Hobson, because in chapter 23, he pays homage to Hobson. And he says, I'm really pretty sympathetic to Hobson. But I think he's wrong in one very important respect. Now, I'm quoting Hobson on, this is Hobson's underconsumption theory. Hobson, very, very, very influential underconsumption. It influenced Lenin. Hobson wrote a book, Imperialism, and then Lenin wrote a book, Imperialism. And basically, it's that if too much of national income was saved, there wasn't enough left for consumption, and they had to dispose of the surplus savings by, getting them invested abroad and so on. And so there was all that thing that arose. And this is how Hobson expresses it. Yeah, overproduction, oversaving leads to overproduction. Overproduction leads to glut leads to unemployment. That's straight Hobson, underconsumption. This is Keynes writing to Hobson. The essence of my argument is that no more savings can come into existence than is provided for by the outlet in current investment. If the inducement to investment is weak relative to the propensity to save, the result is a deficiency of effective demand, which leads to diminished employment. And the unemployment is increased by whatever figure is necessary, so to impoverish the community, to reduce the amount of people desire to save with equality to the amount they're willing to invest. So there's no oversaving. There can't be oversaving. Saving is always equal to investment. And therefore, the problem is not overinvestment, but underinvestment. And so at the root of Hobson's view, which is why it was so influential with Marx, is that it's the ownership of productive tools by the capitalist class that enables this oversaving to take place, because they can then skew the distribution of income towards themselves. And as the marginal propensity to consume is lower among the rich, you get a phenomenon of oversaving. I mean, that was the way the theory went. But Keynes never believed that. And what Keynes said is, dear Hobson, you've made one mistake. And that is, you don't have a theory of interest. Well, of course, Hobson had a theory of interest. What Keynes meant is he didn't have an independent theory of interest. His theory of interest was strictly neoclassical. That is, changes in interest rates automatically equalize private saving and investment, giving rise, on his maldistribution theory, to the phenomenon of oversaving in relation to the investment opportunities at home, so that you then had a surplus that was invested abroad. Now, the root of so how does Keynes propose to deal with this issue of saving and underinvestment, saving and investment not being equilibrated by any changes in the rate of interest? So the most important thing his policy was directed was seizing control of the long run rate of interest from the saving class. Somehow they have to be deprived of their control over the long run rate of interest. And you remember, because that control, which we talked about it yesterday, was really resulted in a rate of interest that was too high to stimulate a full employment volume of investment, because it was a reward for parting for money not a reward for starting enterprises of any kind. One of the things it's very hard to understand, put oneself back in the mind of 19th century economists, and they only really started being distinguished with the subject marginal theory, is that the rate of interest and the rate of profit were regarded as identically the same. And that came out of a tradition of a farming community in which you put aside some of your wheat that you grew in order to feed yourself in the winter when you needed to, let's say, refurbish your machinery or buy some new machinery or something. There was no separation between the two acts of saving and investment, and there was no separation in the language that was used between, to describe it. So the idea that the rate of profit on enterprise might be different from the rate of, say, interest on saving only gradually emerged. And it's only then that you got a theory of the rate of interest as something that equilibrated the two things. And it was this equilibration now that Keynes was simply saying does not happen. And that says it doesn't happen because the interest rate is really the rate for not hoarding. It's what people who have money expect to get from parting with their money, from giving their money up. And that's why it doesn't do the job that the classical rate of interest was supposed to do. Now, I think Keynes was actually a long-term underconsumptionist, and in that sense, I agree with Hobsbawm in the long run. Once accumulation was no longer a priority, and he hoped that time would come as more capital became more and more abundant. You didn't have to the importance of accumulation declined. Then schemes for the higher taxation of high incomes would come into their own because you didn't then have to, save as the society wouldn't have to save as much, because it wouldn't save as much because it wouldn't have to invest as much. I mean, capital becomes abundant. The rate of investment then falls as the marginal productivity of capital declines over time, and then of course you do get the problem if there's still a persistently high rate of saving. Then you might get a problem of realization at that point. So basically, in the long run, he suggests we must encourage consumption as soon as it becomes possible to have a high level of consumption without jeopardizing the investment in higher productivity. In other words, without jeopardizing productivity gains. So, but he's very, very cautious about this. He says only experience can show how far it's safe to stimulate the average propensity to consume without foregoing our aim of depriving capital of its scarcity value within 1 or 2 generations. So he's still cautious about taxing the rich, even though he says in the longer term, you may, as you get more towards capital saturation, then you have to start encouraging consumption more, and that would involve taxing the higher incomes. And then he's, I think this is worth just noticing. Well, anyway, something seems to have gone wrong. Let's see if it's here. Yes, interest today rewards no genuine sacrifice any more than does the rent of land. The owner of capital can obtain interest just because capital is scarce, just as the owner of land can obtain rent because land is scarce. But while there may be intrinsic reasons for the scarcity of land, there are no intrinsic reasons for the scarcity of capital. Therefore, blah, 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 in the long run, you know, you'll have to not in the long run, except in the event of the individual propensity to consume proving as such a character. God, some of this is a bit, you know, the net saving in conditions of full employment comes to an end before capital has become sufficiently abundant, and then you could have communal saving if you needed it. If saving had become insufficient, you tax the rich, and if you needed a bit more saving, you would have state saving. So, to sum up the thrust of this discussion of Keynes's approach, he doesn't associate social justice with income inequality, nor did he think the redistribution of wealth and incomes was the effective mechanism for maintaining full employment, since it would slow down growth before capital had become sufficiently abundant. And so what's implied by this quotation, of course, is something rather famous, which is the euthanasia of the rentier. As capital becomes more abundant, the rate of return on ownership of capital it does fall, and therefore the rentier he regarded as a passing phase of capitalism. But while it was there, of course, it actually slowed down the arrival of the moment when the rentier became superfluous. So the rentier was determined to maintain his position in the scheme by ensuring that the economy remained underemployed, if you like. So that would continue to make capital scarcer than it would be, because you weren't actually then investing in the full capacity of the economy to produce output. You were slowing down the growth of the economy, and anything that kept capital scarce, such as high rates of interest, would of course fortify the position of the rentier. So I mean that was the plot. Now, let me go on quickly. Here's something on I can't see it. I have a it's not here, sorry. Oh yeah, here we are. Because I've come to Keynes on usury. And that seems to me a very important and distinctive part of his idea of statesmanship. I mean, the direction of his statesmanship. Look at this. There remains an allied but distinct doctrine which deserves rehabilitation and honor. I mean the doctrine that the rate of interest is not self-adjusting at a level best suited to social advantage, but constantly tends to rise too high, so that the wise government is concerned to curb it by statute and custom, and even by invoking the sanctions of the moral law. Provisions against usury are among the most ancient economic practices of which we have record. The destruction of the inducement to invest by an excessive liquidity preference was the outstanding evil, the prime impediment to the growth of wealth in the ancient and medieval worlds. That is Keynes's economic history. And he saw the anti-usury laws as attempts to weaken the position of the usurer, the person who charged interest on the ownership of money. Just ownership of money gives you a power over the producer, because the producer borrows and you can charge an interest, as high an interest, if maybe, as you can, and especially the more powerful you are, the higher you are. Now it's interesting. It's the money lender, not the capitalist, which is the evil genius which stalks Keynes's economic landscape. a vision which no doubt owes a great deal to the anti-Semitic stereotypes common in Keynes's formative years. And of course, it's been exploited in exactly that way. You know, it was exploited that way in Christian Europe, and it remains. It remains today. I mean, under the surface. I can give you one or two current examples of in countries where, of course, it is still implicit under the surface. The money lender, the financier, is the evil bit of capitalism, not the producer, not the private owner, not the farmer, not anyone who produces output. The evil is the person who actually steals the output of the honest person. His power enables him to do so, and then lends out the money at a higher rate of interest, high rates of interest. So it's easy enough to show that all of Keynes's schemes to strengthen the inducement to invest involve the destruction of the power, as he called it, of uninterrupted usury. Now, I now turn to the role of fiscal policy. And the role of fiscal policy, let's start it by saying that the aim of Keynes's policy was full employment by design rather than full employment by accident. Full employment by design meant maintaining a high level of public or subsidized private investment. Why? In order to maintain a continuously low level of long-term interest rates. They were quite connected. They weren't alternative to interest rate policy, fiscal policy. It was a way of getting the right long-term rate of interest. And you know, you're often taught in a way that, see, this was the alternative because you know monetary policy doesn't work and so on, so we have to have fiscal policy. But that wasn't there in Keynes's original idea. Well, of course, against the background of the treasury orthodoxy of his day, Keynes's idea that budgets might be unbalanced by design was highly unorthodox. Yet in the history of state finance, to take the economic history of the matter, unbalanced budgets have been the norm. This is because the main historical function of state finance was to raise money for war and for building projects. In these demands of state and church are to be found the origins of debt finance. When tax revenues were meager, sovereigns resorted to money lenders and then defaulted one way or another on their debts. Wars and church building provided full employment by accident. You can put it that way. And there are passages in the general theory which say exactly this. Fortunate were the pharaohs of Egypt because they built pyramids, and, you know, medieval Europe employed lots of craftsmen and construction people building churches. Of course, they didn't really add to the wealth. And therefore they didn't create assets of the kind that capitalism, but of course they provided employment for people. And they were financed by borrowing. I mean, the states didn't have the revenues from taxes. They financed by borrowing, and so you had a class of lenders that sprang up in order to finance the projects of sovereigns. And fortunately, the sovereigns, because they were also sovereigns, they were able to defraud the lenders quite often by defaulting on their debts. At certain points, states really renounced the possibility of defaulting on their debts because they realized that then they wouldn't be creditworthy if they kept defaulting on their debts. And they couldn't just shoot the lenders as they used to be able to do in the past. So at that point, the creditor regained control. And whereas in medieval Europe, there was always this battle between the creditor and the debtor, because the debtor was so often the sovereign. It was a more equal struggle. But by the time the 19th century, when Keynes was growing up, came about, the creditor was once more in control. So just a context. When Keynes advocated loan-financed expenditure, in other words, borrowing in order for state investment, he did it in two contexts. First was in the 1920s, when the rate of interest was fixed by commitment to the gold standard. So Britain revalued, it overvalued its currency. It had to attract capital to London by means of a high interest rate. The high interest rate was the interest rate was too high, bank rate, to maintain full employment. So there was heavy unemployment. So Keynes comes along and says, given the high interest rate institutionally fixed, then we have to have deficit finance. And so he supported Lloyd George's program of public spending in 1929. So there was, that was the first context in which Keynes started advocating fiscal policy as a way of raising unemployment. The second context was in the depression of the 1930s, when the interest rate was fixed then by liquidity preference, or the liquidity trap, if you like. Using fiscal policy was then essential. And I gave you a quote yesterday, I think, in which he says you might get into a situation where the animal spirits of the entrepreneur are so depressed that they can't pay any kind of interest rate at all. In that case, you have to step in with state public investment. And that's the second case. And then you have Keynes's article, The Means to Prosperity, in 1933, where he uses Kahn's multiplier for the first time for estimating the multiplied effects of a particular dose of public investment. Then, of course, so that's the second context. The third context is a more interesting one, and that is in his pamphlet, How to Pay for the War, in 1940, where again, fiscal policy here is shown applicable to a period of inflation rather than deflation. I mean, hitherto it's been because interest rate has, for one reason or another, been too high, and fiscal policy is a device to force down the long run interest rate. But here you have a war economy, and in a war economy, you have excess demand, and therefore fiscal policy is the way to deal with excess demand, not interest rate policy. You see, it's a very important argument here. The normal thing would then be, okay, you have excess demand, war economy, interest rates shoot up in order to cut off the excess demand. Keynes says, no, you need a low interest rate all the way through the war. Why? Because once it goes up, expectations will now then start to be centered on high interest rates instead of low interest rates. So the way to deal with excess demand is by increasing taxes. And he had a very ingenious way of increasing taxes. He said the workers will have to be taxed. They'll have to, of course, share in the sacrifice of the war. But what we'll do is, they can get as much as they want. We won't interfere with wage bargaining. We'll just confiscate a portion of their income and put it in a fund for them to use after the war. So it was called deferred pay. And it was very clever, and it had lots of potential, which was never taken up. I mean, one of them would have been to finance post-war social insurance policies, where everyone, instead of the state, you could have, it would have been every citizen would have had a pot of deferred pay, which could be, you know, put into insurance funds or whatever it might like. So there would have been a different structure of assets had any of that had that idea been adopted. In fact, it wasn't adopted, and it was never as important a part of wartime budgeting as Keynes hoped it would be. Of course, in a way, you had exactly this kind of situation, didn't you? In COVID-19, in a way. I mean, basically, we were sort of similar to a war economy in some very important respects, and fiscal policy again. I mean, what was happening was that a part of the population was prevented from working on civilian production, but it had to be paid. Now, which is almost equivalent of saying you were transferring people from civilian production to war production. But of course, there wasn't any, it wasn't that transfer. But of course, what Keynes hoped would emerge from his plan was that this would be an anti-inflation weapon, whereas COVID-19, the COVID crisis didn't really produce any anti-inflationary finance. So that when the industry started reopening again, you got an upsurge in inflation. Now, my last, well, I'm doing quite well. I haven't quite come to the end of my time. Let me just take two instances of the application of this creditor-debtor issue in Keynes, two applications to policy. The first is Article 232 is the Versailles Treaty. Article 232 called on Germany to make compensation for all the damage done to the civilian population of the Allied and associated powers and their property. In other words, Germany had to pay back a huge war debt, and it was called reparations. Initially, the Allies wanted Germany to pay the whole cost of the war, and that was estimated to be, well, $120 billion for, you know, paid over 30 years and so on. And Keynes was Britain's chief treasury representative at the Treaty of Versailles. And here's Keynes. He produced what he called his grand scheme for the rehabilitation of Europe. He's only about 30. I mean, he's very young, but then he wasn't very ambitious. Here was his great plan for the rehabilitation of Europe. What did it involve? All inter-allied debts were to be cancelled. And the balance, cancelled or reduced, sorry, and the balance discharged by means of a German debt, and that Germany would issue bonds of 6.7 billion, free of interest for 5 years, and in payment of its reparations bill and the residue of all inter-allied debts. So the bulk of the debt was inter-allied debts. I mean, you know, debts were huge. They'd all emerged with huge debts. I mean, you know, Italy owed a huge amount of money to France, and France owed a huge amount of money to Italy, to Britain, and Britain owed a huge amount of money to America, and then Germany now had to pay huge amounts of money so that all these other countries could pay back what they owed to each other. And Keynes said, let's eliminate all this nonsense. We're never going to get Europe going again or any enterprise flourishing unless we break these chains, these iron cage of debt, to shatter it. And he proposed a very ingenious way of doing it. Of course, it was turned down. He reflected on this afterwards. And here's what he wrote. Yeah, the war debts are a case of pure usury. We borrowed nothing except for the purposes of war. War loans should never be made except out of sympathy with the cause of the borrower. and the gradual repayment of the sum lent without interest is the most that could be expected. If I lend to a man to help him expand his business, I'm entitled to ask interest. But if I lend money to help a friend, to help him out of a tight place, there can be no question of his earning a profit. I expect no more than the repayment of my loan. And then, you know, that's the modern morality of it. But the consequence of it is, here he is, a debtor nation does not love its creditor. If debts are forgiven, a stimulus will be given. We'll never be able to move again unless we can free our limbs from these paper shackles. A general bonfire is so necessary that unless it can be made orderly and good-natured, I don't know, something's happened here. Oh yeah, blah, 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 blah. A general will grow into conflagration that will in the end destroy Europe. And he said that, you know, unless we get rid of all this, vengeance shall not limp. And vengeance came. And so you understand something of Keynes's attitude to the creditor-debtor relationship as the cause of much of the bitterness. And so then you get to the Second World War, and he's terrified that the Allies will do exactly the same thing this time. And so he starts fighting against the creditor pressure, because here, I mean, in one sense, America was behaved much better in the Second World War than it did in the First World War, because the Lend-Lease program was not, it didn't lend the money to Britain. It's called Lend-Lease. It gave it the money. It was a grant. Britain gave something in return, promises of one kind, but there was no interest or repayment attached. But as soon as the war ended, the Americans stopped Lend-Lease. And at that point, Britain was still, you know, it had a huge current account deficit. It needed money to plug it. And so it went to America for a loan. And Keynes was the chief negotiator in Washington for the American loan. And what he said, he discussed it. The Americans said, Keynes wanted a grant as a continuation of Lend-Lease with no interest attached. The Americans wanted interest. And this is his reflection. In 1945, he's discussing it. In other words, it is usury to extract from the borrower some amount additional to the true sacrifice of the lender, which the weakness of the borrower's bargaining position or his extremity of need makes feasible. I find it interesting to put it this way because it really amounts to exactly the same thing as my theory of liquidity preference. Very clear. So he doesn't succeed. The Americans insist on attaching 2% of interest to the loan. And so what does Britain do? It defaults by devaluing. I mean, Keynes sort of understood all this would happen. He said, why go through all this nonsense? But still, there was something left, and Britain went on paying little sums of money for the American debt until about 3 or 4 years ago, I think, you know, £100 a year was left or something. And people very patriotic Britons used to leave in their wills money to the Treasury to go on paying off the American debt loan of 1946. You know, small amounts. I don't know what happened to these amounts of money. I mean, what happened to them? Did they disappear somewhere into the Treasury's coffers, or were they actually transferred to the United States Treasury? I don't know, but it was part of the residue. Anyway, Keynes sets up the plays an important role in creating the Bretton Woods system in 1944. But again, his main policy is rejected. How does he justify it? His International Clearing Union plan. This is the quotation. We need a new system because under the gold standard, adjustment was compulsory for the debtor and voluntary for the creditor. So the creditor under the gold standard system could accumulate money and it didn't have to lend it out. It could, in other words, either hoard it as great big, gold reserves stuck in the vaults of Fort Knox, or lend it out at a usurious rate of interest. So his scheme was designed to prevent permanent current account surpluses. Any country that ran a current account surpluses for more than a year would have it confiscated and just transferred to the debtor. The debtor would also be under some pressure, actually, to put its house in order. But he wanted a symmetrical system, not one that favored the creditor. The Americans, of course, weren't having any of it. They were the main creditor country at the time, and they wanted freedom to dispose of their credits or their surpluses in any way they wanted, whether for purposes of building alliances or punishing, enemies or whatever, or simply earning the interest that they felt they were entitled to. So they rejected it, and the IMF had no provision for surplus creditor, no provision for surplus country adjustment. They were under no, and so the situation which Keynes found offensive, that is that the adjustment has to be done, is compulsory for the debtor but voluntary for the creditor, still applied under the Bretton Woods system, which was actually a modified gold standard. And there we are. It was partly mitigated by all kinds of things. SDRs were issued, and there were reforms, but the basic position remains the same. And now, of course, boots on the other foot. I mean, America is the permanent debtor, and China is the permanent creditor. And there's big, and now, of course, as Keynes thought would happen under this system, you're getting growing demand in the United States for protection. And when you get these current account imbalances, the collapse of globalization follows very soon afterwards, because people will protect themselves. And so his scheme for balancing the positions of creditor and debtor were defeated. Just one contemporary echo. Milton Friedman's monetarist counter-revolution in the 1980s and the Reagan-Thatcher supply-side reforms restored to the creditor class a great deal of control over the value of money by imposing policy and legal impediments to inflation. And this enabled the Eurozone to be set up as a gold standard in its most rigid form. Surplus countries were put under no constraint in accumulating surpluses, and deficit countries were denied four crucial protections offered by the Bretton Woods system: trade controls, capital controls, short-term official lending facilities, and small devaluations. So the assumption was that competitive pressures would then force all members to a competitive equilibrium. And then we know what happened. You had the financial crisis, 2008, which was a recapitulation of really, in a way, of 1929, 1930, but Germany, ironically, not being the main debtor, but the main creditor, and imposing on Greece and, the same sort of, punishments and conditions that were imposed on Germany. at the time of the Versailles Treaty. So where do people learn? Where is the learning process going on? I'd just like to end it on that note. But I hope I've given you an idea of where Keynes is coming from in his approach to statesmanship and approach to policy. I haven't, of course, dealt with every single policy proposal he ever made, but I hope I've given you an idea of how he saw Keynes policy as an alternative both to laissez-faire capitalism and to the socialist view that you have to overthrow the capitalist system. Thank you.
So thank you again for your time. So I will propose to you the question of yesterday about Henry, Dexter, White, and Keynes relationship, and also if Keynes was satisfied with the outcome. And finally, so 3 in 1, about his proposal of Bacon. So the kind of basket of currencies that he tried to develop again as an alternative to the American.
Yeah. Yes, I think they got on as well. Keynes, Harry Dempster White. I don't think for a moment Keynes knew that Dexter White was also an agent, a Soviet agent. I mean, which now has become pretty clear. I mean, he was regarded by the Soviets as an asset, and in the word of espionage, an asset means you work for the person who regards you as an asset. How much he gave away of any interest or importance, I mean, I don't think he knew any military secrets. I mean, he kept the Russians informed, presumably, of what they were hatching up in the world of money and trade, and that had military implications. But I think Harry Dexter White, I mean, I don't think he ever thought there was a conflict. He had a view that the peace of the world really depended on the friendship of the United States and the Soviet Union, and therefore they were allies, and therefore there shouldn't be any secrets between them. But of course, technically, he was under an obligation not to. He revealed classified material, and you work for a government department, you sign a promise not to do that. So in that sense, and of course, Harry Dexter White was very, very pro-British. I mean, he was pro-Soviet, really. He said Britain was an encumbrance. I mean, it was stopping, it was interfering, in the grand alliance that he saw was the only real hope for the world. So that's point one. No, Keynes wasn't really satisfied with the results of Bretton Woods, but he said it was the best we could do. Some people in Britain wanted to reject the Bretton Woods. I mean, there was a strong anti-campaign by the Beaverbrook Press, for example, not to accept the Bretton Woods settlement and try to create an imperial currency bloc on its own. And Keynes said, no. This is the first step. We'll do it better. In 10 years' time, it'll be better. And you've got to start this institution building here. And he made a speech to the Lords, a very important one, in defense of it. So that's really the second point. And the third point was which?
About the basket currency.
Yeah, well, that was also an ingenious idea. It was really to give them the IMF a money creating power. I mean, it was it was Banco was simply bank money, and banks created money. I mean, by advancing credit to borrowers, and they created the money because they didn't have the money in deposits. So in a way, he was urging the same property onto the his international clearing union, Banco was just a convenient word, so that you wouldn't always have to distinguish between which currencies were being, created. And I think I don't think there was any. I think the Americans didn't like the idea of Banco because it did suggest a bank, a money creating power in the clearing union, which they didn't want. They thought of it as a fund in which countries contributed certain amounts, and you couldn't actually create the fund can't create any new money. It can only dish out what's been deposited with it. I mean, that's the nature of a fund. It can invest the money, sure, but it can't actually create new money. And Banco was therefore not acceptable as a currency of the fund, because it suggested a money creating power. I think that's the simplest way I can answer the question. It may not be very satisfactory, but I think that's what it was.
Do I have to come down?
Yeah. Well, only you can shout, but I won't hear you otherwise.
There's a microphone here.
I think that the microphone over there.
Understand. So, from what you told us, it seems that Keynes, during his life, lost all policy battles he was involved with. No? The reparation after the First World War, the employment policy in the late 20s, the establishment of a new international monetary system. Perhaps he won the end of the gold standard in the early 30s. I remember there is a video of Keynes explaining to the British people that like dropping out of the gold standard was quite a good thing. But do you think that perhaps he was vindicated after he died, so in the first decades after the Second World War, and to what extent?
Well, I think, yeah, there are two questions in a way. One is, it's always struck me as one of the huge paradoxes of history, and one which we're very unwilling to accept, that progress isn't linear, and you require something really terrible before some sensible things can be done. Terrible things to happen. Keynes was, actually quite aware of this. He wrote in 1939, look, here's my theory. I think I've made the case, but it will require another war to test it. The war will be the experiment. Isn't that a horrible idea, actually, if you come to think of it? The war is creates the laboratory conditions which you couldn't get in any other way. I mean, I think that goes on the whole time. I think people use wars to test out their weapons. I think they're doing it in Ukraine now, actually. But I think it's an awful thought that this is. Anyway, so in that sense, the war then was the experiment that showed that Keynesianism could be made to work. Paradoxically, in an inflation controls sense, rather than in a deflation control sense, but the arithmetic worked. They didn't have inflation in the Second World War, unlike in the First World War. I mean, they had a bit, but not much, and not after Keynesian budgetary policy was introduced. 1941, 45, there was very, very small inflation in Britain, and the economy was bursting with activity. So that showed that it worked. And so then you could apply it afterwards. I think there are many other ways in which, after the war, Keynes, he was both vindicated. I mean, the second way in which he was vindicated, I think, is that the record of employment and inflation in the period 1950 to 1970, let's say 48 to 72 or 3, was the best the Western world's ever had. I mean, growth was higher. There was very full employment. There was technical progress of 2 or 3% a year, and on average, and there was very low inflation. I mean, you know, in fact, at the exact time when Milton Friedman was arguing towards the end of the 60s that there was a cumulative build-up of inflationary expectations as a result of Keynesian policy. In the mid-60s, the inflation rate in Britain, certainly I know, was lower than it had been in the 50s. So where was all this build-up of inflationary expectations? Still, I think there was a problem with Keynesian policy as it was trying to do too much, and there was a sort of hubris, very well expressed by Samuelson, you know, who said, well, you know, we can get whatever rate of inflation we want, we can get whatever rate of growth we want, we can get whatever rate of employment we want, we could get whatever productivity we want just by pressing these levers. And there was a kind of, you know, they thought of themselves as gods, these sort of Keynesian planners and economists. And it just went to their head. Keynes would have said, read my essay on Burke, which I wrote as an undergraduate. And there's a huge warning against hubris. But as Hayek used to say, when he said, Hayek said, I remember my last conversation with Keynes. He said, and I warned him about the dangers of Keynesian policy. And Keynes said, don't worry, as long as I'm there, those dangers won't be realized. And Hayek said, but he wasn't going to be there. He died a year later. Well, we can have an early, unless you anyway have more questions. I want to have a cup of coffee anyway, so I'll just have my coffee, and if you want to carry on asking anything else, I'll be very happy to. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
Quindi sì, Arthur Keynes. Oh.
That's film there. Talking about the end of the gold standard.
Yeah, this one is.
There may be one or two others. Certainly rendering. It's when he's talking about maybe. And but not many.
No, no, nel senso.
And so because there were news.
Well, I mean, I didn't really.
Cioè, restituisce la
Similarity way of or I mean,
This is 1921.
yeah, but basically how it was age and the power of these metaphors, because of course when you read general theory, when you read
I'm going to actually coffee. I'll just say, if you want some coffee, I'll show that. Okay, well, yeah.
I'm getting, I want everything wet.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it's 100% on this.
As our residents. Yes.
It's not just like a PDF.
cosa? Paper is okay.
No, very just like the whole. Okay.
I get it.
It's a collection.
okay.
Arriva la stessa l'instabilità strutturale solo Marx non è che
Cioè, questa roba dice che lui era argomento del fatto che non era più politico, forse che prodotto, perché c'era un po' più della serie attivismo, c'era un po' più la mazzoccato del caso, della serie facciamo anche robe che ti danno dei risultati, cioè
forse
lui era convinto del fatto che il progetto laboratorio sul potenzialista, per lui c'era una fine di quella cosa.
esatto, tra l'altro infatti così intanto dice citando uno storico perché mi ritrovo qualche dice chissà cosa avrebbe detto Karl Marx vedendo una rivoluzione socialista in Russia, cioè il paese più arretrato dove non c'era una classe dei lavoratori perché erano tutti servi della gleba e hanno fatto la rivoluzione, mentre l'Inghilterra che doveva essere
Quella più
invece è arrivato tipo Keynes a dire no, tranquilli, ci sono alcune cose, tipo cambiamo l'ingranaggio e si va avanti.
No, comunque sì, magari domani una domanda del genere la farei, ma anche perché appunto la volevo fare oggi, però poi non ho complimento, ho detto, dico, aspetta, prima che dico stronzate, dico, dictionary di cosa vuoi che parli, cioè non è che parlerà di droghe.
È assurdo, è troppo affascinante. Cioè,
Non so dove stai.
ma tra l'altro noi fossimo piccoli.
Adesso io vedo il tecnico di venire.
Sì, ma adesso prima di questo stage. Mi spaventa meno male. Anche con musica normale, poi c'è. Questo che fa per lì, per male, perché per il cuore. No, ha detto che chissà come mai mancasse wow. Sono stato non so perché stamattina c'è tutta una classe che ci ha detto che ha fatto lo stato del pensiero, ha fatto quello che c'è, e non l'occhio di uno che
Cioè, vedremo che di queste robe esatto, il maggiore esponente di tutto il mondo, cioè il maggiore condividore
del pensiero di Keynes, in generale con l'istituto se ne frega. No, cioè, oggi non ce n'è nessuno.
Beh sì, però c'è anche chi fa scienze politiche qui. Voglio dire.
Tra l'altro non mi pare parlassi di robe impossibili da cogliere.
Cioè, però io tipo, ne so, capitato che sono andato ad un evento, poi abbiamo avuto un sacco di persone, non c'è avuto
Sì,
tempo,
quello
ma anche
che
poi
c'era-
anche docenti, cioè, a Skidelsky, cioè, nel senso, immagino che ci siano docenti di scienze politiche a cui avrebbe piacere che ci vedano.
Ma in realtà è stato pubblicizzato sui social.
Sì, ho capito, i social va bene, ma anche le mail sono girate a tutti i dottorandi,
Sì,
a tutti
sì.
i docenti.
Sì, alla comunità, diciamo, accademica.
Io ho mandato il messaggio a Francesco quando ho iniziato, perché non ho visto Francesco, non ho visto neanche gli altri, però ho mandato soltanto a Francesco in realtà perché so che è quello che si può dimenticare degli orari. E quindi ho
Sì.
detto, vuoi vedere che magari in biblioteca pensa che sia alle 2:30?
Vedere in biblioteca.
Non lo so, mi ha risposto, ha visto il messaggio ed è venuto un minuto dopo, ecco, però probabilmente non se n'era accorto. Però, cioè, vedo Skidelsky
Sì, sì. Non lo so, Cristian mi diceva.
comunque probabilmente quella c'è la diretta su YouTube attiva. Perché a me aveva detto al tipo di venire alle 4.
Ah,
4 meno 10, tipo, perché alle 4 iniziava la Giulia. Però visto che abbiamo finito prima, forse è meglio se magari cercano di. Ma non so dove sia, perché questo tipo è un tipo specifico. No?
non so, sai.
Magari non abbiamo visto tutto.
Mi spiace un po'. Poi io non so cosa dire. E che cazzo di storia? Hai detto, boh, ma magari ci molti.
Certo, ma pure per dire. Cioè, uno,
Anche
per la verità non me la mai.
non me l'aspettavo. Ce l'ho visto spuntare, ho detto spuntare, come vedete, ma che storia? Io infatti più mentre io ho preso prima, sono andato a nel senso che mi ha fatto letture di scuole, io ho visto, però non lo so perché